So at work today, I got to work on something that I had tweeted about, I want to say a couple weeks ago, where I talked about measuring franchises over the last 20 years. What's the best franchise? And you know what? No. So I'll look at drafting and scouting some other day. I will look at franchises with player turnover. I want to take a look at the last 20 years and figure out who's gone through the most goaltenders so we can figure out the real goalie graveyard. But I can measure franchise stability, and I went this way. Playoff appearances versus playoff misses versus getting the second, third round, Stanley Cup final, Stanley Cup wins, and how often they switch GMs and coaches. The GM coach thing it did not get weighted as heavily as playoff success because there are teams that have a lot of success and fire the coaches or GMs regularly. In some cases, there's no patience and it works. And in some cases, there's a ton of patience and it doesn't work. So that was only a small part of what I used for this. But anyways, let's get into the 30. Now, Vegas isn't in this because they haven't finished the season yet. So don't get mad at me for Vegas not being in this. Once this season is done, I'll do an updated version of this. Vegas will be in it because the way I have it weighted, the way that I have the scores done, it would be impossible for Vegas to be a number one team at the end of this year, but they can still have a very good standing at the end of this year if they have a good playoff run. And so I'm going to make this a going forward thing. I'll do this now. So this is from 98-99 until now. There's 18 seasons in all because, of course, we missed the 04-05 season due to the lockout. And at the end of this year, I'll tack on the 20th year, 19th season, and we'll add to these scores or subtract based on whether they missed the playoffs or made them. And then starting next year, I will just drop off 98-99's numbers and tack on the next year's. And then we'll see some real movement. We'll see some movement at the end of this year, but we'll see a real movement in a year. Think of this as kind of franchise power rankings. I guess we'll go with it that way. So this is measuring stability over 20 years. Not this year, not... Okay, so Tampa's number one, because that's not how it works. In 30th place with a score of negative 790 is Florida. I'm not revealing how I got the scores, because to do so would be a bad idea. It really would be a bad idea. Because people are going to be like, wait, you didn't give enough points for this, and you gave too many points for that, and you subtracted too much for this. And then other people would argue, and I have to come up with my own formula so that it's easy to figure out. It's a very easy formula. And Florida's last place. And I don't think you can argue that they wouldn't be last over the last 20 years. This does not include the 96 run to the final because that was more than 20 years ago. At number 29 with a score of negative 720, you want to talk about baggage. Winnipeg inherited from the Atlanta Thrashers a not great history. And so far, Winnipeg, while they're very good this year, their history in Winnipeg hasn't been great either. It looks like they have a great future. They could move up dramatically this season based on however they do in the playoffs, but they're at 29th right now. At 28th, with a negative 600 score, which is impressive, is Columbus. Making the playoffs twice will help them greatly here. So if they make the playoffs this year, that negative will drop. But they've missed the playoffs a lot over their history. And Columbus and Minnesota are both in this because while they weren't in the league in the 98-99 season, as I said about Vegas, I don't really care if teams don't play every season in this because I don't think it's weighted that way. Number 27 with a score of negative 320. Oilers. They made the Stanley Cup final once. Other than that, it's been a rough go. They made the playoffs once since they made the Stanley Cup final, and they're not making it this year either. The Oilers have really, really struggled as a franchise for 20 years, and it shows in this score. Connor McDavid, if you can save this team, you really deserve the nickname everybody gives you. Number 26, with a score of negative 295. Here you go, Islanders fans. You guys can go ahead and tweet this out at the Islanders. And the funny thing is the Islanders did not lose points for regularly firing coaches or GMs because their GMs stick around for a long time. And again, that's something that doesn't make Islanders fans happy. There's a number of Islanders fans that want to get rid of their GM. And this score at 26th, a lot of this is under Garceau's watch. So take it with a grain of salt. This would seem to indicate that those who want to get rid of him are probably right. In 25th with a score of negative 290, so they're 5 points ahead of the Islanders, and that's Arizona. The Coyotes, this is why I always find it weird when Winnipeg Jets fans want to get back a history. The Winnipeg Jets weren't a very good team either. If the Winnipeg Jets from the 80s were included in this list, and I was doing a list for the last 30, 35 years, their score could be worse. The Arizona Coyotes have played very well the last 20 games in the NHL. It doesn't mean they're going to make the playoffs next year, but at least there's some hope. But they're going to drop again. Because of the way I've got this set up, where negative points are awarded for when you miss the playoffs, it's going to be negative points for Arizona. Number 24, with a score of negative 230, because they've missed the playoffs a number of times in the last 20 years as well, and that's Calgary. The Flames, for all the talk about Saddle Dome and what they're going to do with the franchise, it is a solid franchise now, and I feel bad that they have this rating on this chart, this list. But again, the Flames haven't put it together, and they haven't gone on. They went on the run in 2004, but the way I have this structured, if you go on one run to the final, it helps. It gets you a little bit ahead, but not that far. At number 23, with a score of negative 115, this is the first Stanley Cup winner we've seen, and that's Carolina. Now, to get a negative score when you're a Stanley Cup winner requires about a half decade of missing the playoffs. So for Carolina, it's been a lot of missing the playoffs. And over the last 20 years, it's like I've said, when Carolina makes it, they're dangerous because they've made the conference finals a couple times, they've won the Stanley Cup, but they don't generally make the playoffs. So it's a franchise that it really is feast or famine with Carolina, and it's been a lot of famine lately, quite a bit. Number 22, Buffalo with a negative 60 score. I said famine, and all I can picture now is Sarah McLachlan singing every time I see that logo. Buffalo, you guys know what I'm talking about. Buffalo, negative 60. At the start of this, so at the start of what I'm looking at, the timeline, 98-99, yeah, they were in the finals. They were a good team. And they haven't gone through a lot of coaches because Lindy Ruff was there for quite a long time. But there hasn't been any success over the last decade. And that's a really strong negative for the Buffalo Sabres. And it gets them into negative numbers. Despite the fact that at the start of this, they had a very good record. Which means that at the end of this year, when I factor things in, they're going to drop. But then at the end of next season, if they haven't got themselves back in the playoffs, and I'm pulling the results from 98-99 out, saying, well, that was over 20 years ago, I'm pulling that out, Buffalo's numbers could get even worse. Number 21 with a score of positive 40 at 21st is Toronto. And they're getting better. And if I had done this like last season and didn't have last season's results to go with, Toronto's score would have been worse. So, good on them for getting better. They're going to gain points this year. It's a matter of how many they get. It's a matter of teams ahead of them and whether or not they drop. And getting out of the first round. All the Leafs need to do, for all the talk about whether they are or they aren't contenders, just get out of the first round. Just get out of that first round, and you're golden. And because the sky's the limit for Toronto. I really believe that. Number 20 with a score of positive 50 is Minnesota. Minnesota would be so much higher if they could get further in the playoffs. As I said, this formula I used, it weights in favor of teams that go further in the playoffs. So Minnesota gets weighed down, not because they miss the playoffs a lot, because they really don't, but because they don't go very far in the playoffs. They get eliminated in the first round, they get eliminated in the second round, and it's more of the same. And I'd like to see that change, but until it does, they're stuck here. Number 19. And the next team that has a Stanley Cup in the last 20 years on this list with a score of plus 190 is Tampa, and they're going to go up. Obviously, this year, they're having a sensational season. They already have 100 points. They're going to end up with likely 110 plus. And Tampa is one of the best-run franchises, if not the best-run franchise in the league. We can argue about that, and we often do. But Tampa has had some really lean years in between. If not for those lean years and the rebuilds, these guys would be top 10. Number 18 with a score of plus 240, Nashville. Nashville doesn't miss the playoffs very often, but before this last year's run to the Stanley Cup Finals, they also didn't do very much in the playoffs very often. Now they're a team that performs in the playoffs. Now we're expecting them to make it to the Stanley Cup Final. We'll see. I remember when they got Peter Forsberg and they loaded up and it was like, okay, here they go, and then it just didn't happen. So, when Nashville's expected to do well, they usually disappoint in the playoffs, and when not much is expected of them, they overachieve like last season and the year before. They have the core and they have the defense to do it. They definitely have the goaltending to do it. It's just a matter of getting there. Number 17, with a score of plus 305, is the Canucks. So the Canucks had a modicum of success while Luongo was here and when the Sedins were in their primes, and that's why they have the plus score. Outside of that, it's been a lot of lean years, a lot of down seasons, a lot of underperformance. And so they sit pretty, right in that mediocre mid-range. That's right about where I figured they'd end up being. But they're not in the top half of the league. And that's despite back-to-back President's Trophies, showing what those are worth. At 16, with a score of plus 320, is Dallas. The Dallas Stars won a Stanley Cup in 99, and they really haven't won much since. They got back to the final in 2000. I really had hopes they'd win back-to-back, but of course they didn't. And Dallas has been a tough team to predict over the last 10 years, other than, are they going to choke their way to the playoffs? Yep, probably. And then they do. And that happens regularly with Dallas. And they're trying to do it again this year. It's really frustrating. At number 15, with a score of plus 325, and they haven't won a Stanley Cup in the last 20 years, but Montreal has managed to make the playoffs quite a few times. And they've made it to the conference finals a few times. So they get the points for that. They've played well. They're a good team for the most part over the last 20 years, minus whatever Bergevin's got going on with them right now. I don't know. I don't know how much darker things are going to get, but this score is going to drop. This score will drop because if you miss the playoffs, you lose points. So Montreal's score will drop after the Stanley Cup's awarded. After Stanley Cup's awarded, I'll do this again, likely on the whiteboard. I just don't have a free whiteboard right now where I'd be doing that. But Montreal's going to drop. And then after I do the standings again in June, people will go back to this video and they'll go, oh, I know exactly how he figures this out. I know the numbers. And then we can argue about it later. But it'll be the offseason. I'll have more energy to argue. 14th place with a score of plus 380, Capitals. So here they are. The can't get out of the second round Washington Capitals, but usually make the second round Washington Capitals. 3 years in a row they've been eliminated in the second round, to the point where this year in the second round they would likely play the Penguins. This would be very depressing to the Capitals. I almost think maybe they'd be better off playing the Penguins in the first round and get it over with, and then they can't psych themselves out, and then maybe they win the. I'm delirious, aren't I? 14th place for the Capitals. Hopefully they can change that. 13th place with a score of plus 385, so 5 points ahead of Washington. And since the Rangers are likely to miss the playoffs, they would drop below Washington. The Rangers are going into a rebuild. I don't think it's going to take that long. There's talk about whether or not Jeff Gorton's going to further tear things down after the season. He may. I wouldn't be surprised if he necessarily did, but I really think the biggest changes have taken place now, and I think the Rangers team in the fall is going to be pretty much what they have now, plus a couple of rookies, and they're going to take a shot at it. But the Rangers, number 13. Number 12, with a score of plus 395, and this is the first multiple cup winner in the last 20 years to get on the list, and that's Kings. The Kings had a rebuild at the starting point where I'm measuring success. The Kings have been pretty darn good for the balance of the last decade, and for me, the Kings. I'm fine with this standing, and they were part of the reason why I'd actually changed the Stanley Cup points, because I'm like, this doesn't work. So I did go back and revise my formula after I sent out a picture on Instagram of all my numbers, but and it did help the Kings and moved them up a couple of spots. At number 11 with a score of plus 445 is Colorado. Don't forget, 20 years ago, Colorado was a powerhouse. They were in the midst of as close to a dynasty as they got. They had Sakic, they had Raw, they had Foote, they had Forsberg. They had a very good team. And they're getting back to being a very good team. And they could very well add points this year if they make the playoffs. They could. Number 10 with a score of plus 540. What's insane about this is St. Louis hasn't made the finals in all those years. St. Louis is still top 10 in terms of this chart with franchise stability and measuring success, and they haven't won a Stanley Cup. So fans won't feel happy about the fact they're ahead of teams that have won Stanley Cups, even ahead of the Kings, because that means they've made the playoffs a lot and they haven't won in those playoffs. So congratulations to them for getting that high up, but, ninth place with a score of plus 565 is the Bruins. So Boston has that Stanley Cup in 2011. They have a Stanley Cup final in 2013, and those really helped to move up to this number. The Boston Bruins are a team that is just wildly inconsistent. Coming into this season, I predicted they missed the playoffs, and I was fine with that. I was like, well, they'll probably miss. Next year is probably going to be a better year. And I kept saying, well, this isn't the year next year. I'm looking for next year. And they actually kind of proved me wrong. Just a touch, just a tad. Number 8, with a score of plus 630, is the Ottawa Senators. Yep. The Senators with a Stanley Cup final on their resume and conference finals and just some solid play and not missing the playoffs a lot either. And they end up with a very good score. And again, I don't know if this is going to make anybody feel better about anything. Number 7, with a score of plus 680, Chicago. So here's the 3-time Stanley Cup champion Chicago Blackhawks. They're not as high up as I thought they'd be, but that's because at the start of this, when the period where I started looking at this in 98, 99, they were a disaster. The Blackhawks were a disaster for about the first 5 years of this time period, and it took them a long time to get it all together. And it was right around when they drafted some guys named Taves and Kane that things started to turn around. And now they're one of the higher up teams. Number 6, with a score of 685. So they're 5 points ahead of Chicago, and that's Anaheim. Yep, they won a Stanley Cup in 2007. And Anaheim is one of those teams that they still look like they should be able to win something. Now, there was an article in the paper today about Ryan Kessler and how he can't practice because of his hip. So he doesn't practice at all because of his hip, and he has to loosen it up. If he doesn't loosen it up before a game, he can't play. So he's struggling with the hip injury that he's been dealing with all year, and BX has numerous aches and pains as well. But those are two former Canucks that are hoping to lead to Anaheim somewhere. Both of them well aware they may be on their way out of Anaheim soon. Number 5, with a score of 710, which is pretty darn decent score for a team that's been to the finals once, and that's Philly. Philly has done well. Philly has made it to the conference finals a few times, and they've managed to be in the playoffs most of the time. And again, I think Philly fans would trade this being 5th just for a Stanley Cup. They'd be like, you know what? If we could be in 23rd where Carolina is and have a Stanley Cup in the last 20 years, that'd make us feel better. It's been 40 plus years since the Stanley Cup went to Philly. I don't know if this is the year, but they're a fun team to watch. And they'll likely move up. Because in 4th place with a score of 790 is Jersey. Now, New Jersey has a couple of Stanley Cups over the last 20 years. And that definitely helps. And while they're in a playoff spot at the time I'm recording this, there's no telling if that's going to stay that way or not. Right now, last I saw, Florida's leading the game over Boston, so New Jersey might be in somewhat of a tenuous position here. It might be a little tough. In 3rd place with a score of 1,025, because they don't miss the playoffs, is San Jose. One Stanley Cup final, but they don't miss the playoffs. They make the playoffs almost every year, and they're really, really a solid team, and they've been a solid team for 20 years. It's an impressive record they put together. Again, like Philly, they would probably prefer to have Stanley Cups, but what can you do? In 2nd place, with a score of 1,285, is Pittsburgh. So, Stanley Cups, They make a big difference. They have a few of them in the last 20 years. So despite the fact they've gone through a rebuild or two and they've missed the playoffs here and there, Pittsburgh, when they're in the playoffs, are deadly. And they've got 5 Stanley Cups as a franchise, which is an impressive total. And they're looking to make it 6 this year. And if they do, they'll probably get to first because... Actually, no. They will get to first this year anyways. I just did the math in my head. The team that's first missed the playoffs last year and is likely going to miss the playoffs this year with a score of 1,360. That will drop this year. With a score of 1,360 is the Detroit Red Wings. Ken Holland's been the GM the whole time, so there's no deduction for extra GMs. They haven't gone through a whole lot of coaches either in Detroit. Detroit's had a pretty stable franchise. So I know there's people in Detroit that expect this to change. I expect it to change too, because I expect Ken Holland to probably be out at the end of this year. As I said, going through a lot of GMs and coaches didn't really negatively impact it much, but I had to have that as part of it because I'm trying to measure franchise stability. So there you go. There's 30 through 1. I will do this again after the Stanley Cup is completed. So this summer. That's right, I still do videos during the summer. I do videos every day during the summer. So stay tuned for those. But there you go. 30 through 1. The best and the worst for franchise stability over the last 20 years. From 98-99 until 2017-18. And it will be completed right after the playoffs are done. But this is basically just my way of saying, here's where we're standing right now. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below it. Like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.